If there's one thing that I could recommend that you keep in mind, it's if you're a game developer and you're developing games, would you go to a plumber for advice? Or if you're a painter and you're trying to paint a huge canvas, would you go to an electrician for advice? No. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Everest, I'm Radley, author of Unhuman, and today we're going to be doing a writing workshop on how to self-evaluate. So last time I recorded a video discussing the 3 pieces of advice that I usually give to every single either new writer or new author, and the last piece of advice that I gave was how, you really need to learn how to self-evaluate. And after finish recording that video, I thought about it and I realized it's so easy to say, you need to learn how to self-evaluate, and self-evaluation is an important step, but not everyone necessarily knows how to self-evaluate. So I figured, why not make a video on it talking about the best ways to self-evaluate and to get better at it much faster than you usually would, just from going through the traditional process of writing book after book after book after book. Because you can definitely do that, and that can be your process, but it takes a while. Hopefully through these methods, I can encourage you to not only self-evaluate, but also to do it faster. So let's just get started. The first thing that I notice when people try to self-evaluate is that they either compare or they look for feedback. So when I say comparison, they usually take a book or a friend's writing or something, and they compare and contrast. They look at their writing and they go, oh, well, this dialogue went smoothly, or this dialogue didn't, or this characterization went smoothly, but this didn't. And there is some virtue to that, but what I feel like this process does is it builds up a sense of competition. So you're looking at so many people's writing and you're trying to figure out, well, is my writing better than theirs? That's kind of the mindset that you get stuck in. And obviously that is a very unhealthy mindset, especially if you want to do writing as a professional career. The next thing that I notice that people tend to do wrong is they tend to look for feedback. And when I say look for feedback, I mean they're looking for feedback from friends and from family members and also from schools. So yes, it's really nice to have that support system and to be able to show your work and be like, well, what do you think? Do you think this character's awesome? What do you think about the overall plotline? But here's the thing. Most people don't know how to give good feedback. And on top of that, if they've never written a book before, chances are they don't know what they're looking for or what they're trying to comment on. I've done this personally, and I've had friends who have done this, where we've given our work to someone else to comment, and they've just been like, well, it's good, yeah, I like it, and that's the end of the feedback. It's good, I like it. And as you can imagine, that's not very helpful, especially if you're trying to expand your talents and your skills as an author and as a writer. So you need to stop and probably distance yourself away from that sort of feedback. And lastly, when I was talking about schools, there are 2 things that I see people do when it comes to getting feedback from schools. First, if they're writing middle grade or kids lit or any sort of YA, I've heard people, and I've known people who have taken their novels to these schools and they've basically passed it out among a group of students, and then they've tried to collect feedback. First of all, don't do this. If you try to be traditionally published and you do this, it's highly unethical. Don't do it. It's also very awkward, especially if you try to go to an editor and be like, I took my manuscript to all these schools and they said they loved it. Your editor just is going to know instantaneously that you're unprofessional and that you don't know what you're doing. So don't do that. But on another note, kids lie all the time. So here's a famous example of a book getting published because kids lie. So Neil Gaiman, one of the biggest American authors, when he was publishing his book Coraline, it was a kids' literature book. And his editor looked through the book and they said to Neil, well, Neil, I think this is a really interesting book, but I'm pretty sure this is way too intense and too scary for kids. And Neil was like, you want to know what? You have a daughter. Go ask your daughter. Like, have her read the book. And so the editor then did that. She went to her own daughter and she had her daughter read the book. And she's like, well, my daughter just came back and she said that she loved this. So maybe you're right. Let's just get this published. It came out years later that the editor's daughter had lied about the whole thing. She was terrified by the book and wasn't really sure if it should be published or not. But in the end, she told her mother, the editor, that yes, it should, simply because she was curious where it would go. So needless to say, kids lie. They're not a good source of information. And second of all, when you go to schools and you're trying to get feedback from your work, and you're not just going to like middle school or elementary, like you're actually going to professors. What I've noticed is, first of all, most professors don't have time to look through a whole manuscript. They may be willing to review a chapter or two, but honestly, most professors are very, very busy as it stands. Some of them even have 2 jobs, 3 jobs, so it's very unlikely that you will get your professor to review your manuscript for you. And even if they do, the advice that they give you may not be something that you can even implement. So I'll talk more about that later, about getting appropriate advice and feedback for your skill set. But yeah, those are the 2 things where I see people go wrong, and where people initially start with their self-evaluation. If there's one thing that I could recommend that you keep in mind, it's if you're a game developer and you're developing games, would you go to a plumber for advice? Or if you're a painter and you're trying to paint a huge canvas, would you go to an electrician for advice? No. So just keep that in mind when you are looking for feedback on your book or on your project, that while it is helpful to get some outside perspectives, especially from people who aren't necessarily creators themselves, take it with a grain of salt. That is the first things that I would avoid. But now, like, what would you do in the absence of these 2 things? First of all, I'd recommend a mindset change initially, because when you're going into a new writing process, things are going to be difficult, especially if you've come from that feedback loop where everything that you've done is, you've just looked for feedback from family and friends. So first of all, you're gonna want to change up how you think about your creative writing process. Recognize that it's going to be slow, it's going to be tedious. At some point, it may feel a little bit like a chore simply because there's a lot of work to do. But if you focus on the artistic aspect itself and you focus on how much you're progressing, I guarantee it's going to be much more rewarding overall. Second, you're going to want to learn your process. So here I have 6 tips that I use personally that I would recommend that you try to adapt at least 2 or 3 of. So first, you're going to work on rewriting. So what I mean by rewriting is, I don't mean like take your whole book or project or novel and redraft the whole thing. No, that does not help anyone. It will be a massive waste of time. Don't do that. What I'm talking about rewriting is take a scene or something out of your project and try rewriting it in a different way. So, for example, let's say that you are writing a romance novel, and in this romance novel, a girl and a guy are meeting up at a cafe to get coffee. The story is told from the girl's perspective, so it's in first person. Now, but instead of just ending it right there and saying, okay, well, that's perfect, I'm done, like, I'm happy and content with where this ends, instead try to switch it up. Maybe take it from the first perspective of the guy. What does the guy think about this whole situation? What are his aspirations, his goals? How would you write a male perspective over a female perspective? Next, take it from a third person perspective. Who's serving them their coffee? What does she think about this whole interaction? Does she think it's cute? Does she think it's annoying? Is she just waiting to get off her shift because she's got something else going on at home? And now, take that scene and maybe just switch up the whole scene in general. Instead of it being a short contemporary romance, now it's a space drama. And you have these people sitting in a space cafe. How does the barista then interact and look at these 2 characters? Does she look at them as potential nobility? Does she look at them as potential threats to her safety? As you can see, the more that you practice rewriting and changing things up, the more that you have to think about things in a sort of outside of the box sense. It forces you to literally take everything that you know, and you have to essentially recalibrate and rethink your whole process. And the better that you get at this, the faster that you get at this, the easier it gets. So that's number one. Number two is the most obvious one. You can just practice and go through the whole motions with time. I found that personally, as I've written more and more books, it's gotten easier to just learn how to evaluate and where things are going. But that takes a very, very long time, so probably not your number one go-to. Number three is feedback from others. And this is what I was talking about when I said we're going to be talking about where do you get feedback and what level do you get it at. So one thing that I've learned, and this is how I personally taught myself how to evaluate. This was my number one trick. And what I did is I was on social media platforms or writing platforms for a very, very long time. And what I would do is I would go and I'd look for people who have a little bit more experience in writing than I did. Not a lot. I wasn't going to published authors and being like, here, read my manuscript and give me advice. Like, first of all, published authors don't have time to do that. If somebody sent me a manuscript and be like, please read this, I want to hear all your feedback on it. Even if I did have time to look through the whole manuscript, chances are that whatever I say is probably too high level for what someone is trying to do. So what you need to do is you need to find someone who is just a little bit above you in terms of writing skill. So if you're starting off and you're a teenager, maybe look for somebody who's a college student or somebody who has a few published stories. So essentially look for people who would be in your same group, who you can communicate with, who can relate with, and go to them first. And ideally, once you find that group and you work on your self-evaluation and you work on your writing, you'll be able to essentially step up and step up and step up. At the moment, now that I'm a published author, I can go talk to other published authors and we can discuss things because I'm at a level where I can understand things that we're having discussions about. I don't have to worry about, is this going to go over my head? Am I not going to understand what they're trying to say to me? How much is this advice actually worthwhile? I can look at people who are giving advice and I can look at people who are discussing books and I can immediately tell that this is appropriate, this is my level, that sort of stuff. So find where you fit in and just go for it. I know it may seem a bit awkward at first trying to approach a group, especially if they're already formed, but trust me, this is the fastest way in this whole list that I have to self-evaluate and grow. And if you're looking for websites on where you can do this, NaNoWriMo usually does a good job at grouping people together, especially if you're doing Camp NaNoWriMo. Simply because Camp NaNoWriMo is all about writing in groups. You can also do writing clubs. If you're on campus, there's usually a writing club. So yeah, just look for things around you that can help. Next, this is another big one that also really helped me, but it was something that I had to get into later after I started getting feedback from others, and that was editing for others. So I did content and developmental editing for 4 or 5 years. I did it as a volunteer, so I volunteered to edit people's work. I was not charging them, and as a result, I probably went through hundreds of pieces where I would review the first 3 chapters or so. And what development in content editing is I would go and I'd look through the story and I'd go, well, is this being paced correctly? How do the characters actually look? How does the dialogue sound? Does this all work together cohesively? What would this look like if it were a published book? Are there pieces of information that are missing? So when I go through and I start asking myself those questions, it kind of tricks my brain into thinking about those same things about my own writing. And the more practice that you get at it, and the more that you edit for other people, the quicker that you get at recognizing, well, where are my own faults? Where am I struggling with? Especially if you're writing simultaneously. Because you'll just naturally start to apply all those skills that you're currently learning through your practice of your editing right onto your writing. So that's another big one that I recommend. And keep in mind, you're not editing to do grammatical editing. One thing that I learned from my college level courses in editing was that grammar and punctuation and format, all of that are up for debate. Like, we have rules, but even editors and publishing houses have different formats, have different styles, have different concepts and ways of organizing their editing. So like, yeah, you can go focus on grammar and do that all day long, but ultimately it doesn't matter because everyone has a different idea. So don't focus on grammar, focus on the actual content about these stories. Next is probably one of the least common things that I see people doing to improve, and that is listening to negative critiques and rants. And I don't necessarily mean about your work, because chances are if you're at this stage, you haven't published much work, if any. I'm talking about going and looking up reviews or rants or negative critiques about other books. And the really, really in-depth ones, don't look up the ones that are just like 5-minute, 10-minute, maybe even 15-minute videos. I'm talking, go look up like the hour-long videos and just walk through the whole process, see how people, especially really detailed reviewers, think, and where they go and what their focus is on. Because I guarantee you there is a list that starts to form about the top few things that people focus on and want to read and learn about. And among those are like character setting, world building, all that stuff. You start to pick that stuff up as you're watching these negative critiques and negative reviews. So go pick up some video or some book or something that really critiques and analyzes literature. And try to do the same thing yourself. You know, pick up a book that you're reading or a movie that you're watching and ask yourself, well, if I was a critic, how would I look at this movie? Is it too fast? Is it too slow? Are there plot holes? Are there character devices? Like, look at it and try to be critical about what you're watching or what you're reading. But also, this is probably one of the fun ones that you can do that doesn't take much effort. So it's unusual because I don't see people do it very often, but it is very helpful. And lastly, this one is the one where I feel like people struggle the most and they're very stubborn towards. It's being willing to change up your writing process in general. So what I find is people will get into a writing process or they'll get into a habit, and for the life of them, they will refuse to break or change that habit. They will do everything in their power to make sure that that habit stays. When you start talking to authors and writers and people who do this full time or do it like consistently, you can ask them about their process, and almost every single one of them will have a very, very strict process. Some of them that I've seen have been like, I write from this period of time to this period of time, or I can only write after I exercise, or I can only write after I eat, or I write while I eat. And they get into this mindset of this is exactly how they must write. They can do nothing else but this method. And the reason why this can be sort of detrimental is writing is based on experience and change. So the more that you experience new things and the more that you change as a person, the more interesting that your writing becomes. So once you kind of sit yourself into this, I'm never going to change, this is just how I am, mentality, it can be pretty difficult, especially if you're a new writer, because you're missing out on opportunities to grow and experience new things and change yourself. Authors who are like Stephen King or J.K. Rowling, they've been authors for such long times that they've probably never had to really consider this because they've already done it, you know. They're at such a different level than people who are just beginning. So some things that I recommend is, you know, take notes about what you're writing, maybe try a new outline. One way that I change up my writing is when I'm working on different projects. Say, for example, I need to write something that is much slower and has a lot more prose, I'll write it by hand. It's tedious, it's difficult, but I feel like I get much better results that way than if I were just to write on computer. And if I'm like speed writing, or if I need to jot down an idea or something, something that is very skeleton and thin, I usually write it on my phone. So there's a bunch of ways that I've learned how to write, and patterns and things that I do now that I've experienced and I've really pushed myself to try new things that I feel like new authors or new writers could really take into account. So once you get your process set and you are finally starting to learn how to self-evaluate and you're going through the motions, now you need to change your mindset again. So now you've got everything going, everything's going well, and you feel like you're getting better at what you're doing. Here's the thing that is going to be a kicker for a lot of people. Instead of honing your strengths, you need to hone your weaknesses. So a lot of people I see, they come into writing and they go, well, I'm great at writing fantasy, or I'm great at writing sci-fi, or I'm great at writing character. And then they kind of just ignore other things. Some people will just consider it tedious. They'll be like, I don't want to write about settings or details. I don't like that. I think it's personally obnoxious. But here's the thing. When you publish a book for the first time and you're getting those critiques and those reviews, if you are not working on your weaknesses, it immediately becomes apparent to everyone who has. So your book will not be able to stand up to somebody who has worked on their weaknesses, because their book will be much more well-rounded than yours will be in your strengths. So ideally, once you start working on your weaknesses, it will become a sort of cycle. So let's say you're working on your book and you're struggling with dialogue. You go through and you do your best to evaluate your dialogue, you get it better, and then next thing you know, dialogue is your ultimate strength. You are the professional at dialogue. You can make the conversations sound natural, completely organic, and you can make them sound really crisp and clean. You're not having dialogue tags everywhere. You're not having awkward transitions. It is good, pure dialogue. However, while you've been working on that dialogue, you've noticed that your attention to detail and setting has been slipping. So after you get that dialogue and it's really good and it's really crisp, then you switch your attention to setting and detail and you work really hard on that. You know, you're thinking about the five senses, you're thinking about how would somebody interact with their environment, you're thinking about how color and architecture actually work together, and you finally get that up to that peak writing level that you want. And while you've been doing that, you now recognize, oh, well, my characters seem kind of flat. So that's the whole cycle that you need to be going through. And ideally, the more that you do that, eventually you'll get to a point where you're able to write almost anything the first time around without having to worry about, well, is my dialogue weak? Is my characterization weak? Is my plot weak? Because you will have been working on those weaknesses so consistently, and you'll have been working through them cyclically, that you don't have to worry about, is this all weak? Is this not what I want it to be? And there are tons of examples that I could give about books that obviously don't work through this process or don't have this attitude shift. But at the same time, I don't feel the need to pull in other authors or other content creators to be like, here, look at these people who were fools or whatever. I don't, like, again, that whole idea of competition or like pointing fingers just doesn't appeal to me. But as you read and as you write, you'll notice exactly what I'm talking about. There are people who entirely skip that step, and it's obvious that they can only write one or two things in a genre or with ideas. So lastly, once you start getting that process down and you start working on your weaknesses, the last thing that you're going to want to change is you're going to want to look for more experience. And I'm not saying more experience as in go write a dozen more books, okay? That is helpful, but really what is going to help you the most is looking for unique opportunities to build yourself as a person. I can't remember who said it, but one of the one of the things that I've learned is you can't be interested in people and not even, like, you can't write people if you're not even interested in people. So you need to go learn about yourself. What are you interested in? What are you excited about? What can you learn about? What can you bring to the writing community that is special about you? For example, I'm a dystopian author. I love learning about survival and government tactics. I'm actually in a master's degree program right now where I learn about international security and international law. It's awesome. But somebody else may not agree with me. They may be interested in agriculture and in growing plants or learning about crystals. And there's nothing necessarily wrong about that. We're all different people and we should all be working to build our different strengths. But it is important that you go get your personal experience and learn how to leave your personal mark on your book and your content. Because it's so easy to just be like, well, I love writing, so I'm just gonna write and do whatever I want. But what's the point of writing if you have nothing to write about? So this is actually the number one reason why I don't recommend that people go get a creative writing degree from college or from any university, simply because, well, like, yeah, it is fun to get that feedback and it is interesting to learn from professors and professionals who have lots of experience. I mean, ultimately, you have people like me online who exist to offer that same advice. And furthermore, like, we're free, like, we're not over here charging. And on top of that, that then frees you up to go get more experience and to actually build yourself a good writing career and portfolio. So yeah, these are all the things that I would recommend you start with, especially if you're on the path to self-evaluation and you're on that beginning trajectory for being an author. If you want to hear more about my advice, please go check out the video that I posted last week that talks about the 3 pieces of advice that I give to starting creators. I give them to everyone, so it's very important that, like, people who are starting out hear it, because it will definitely change your perspective on what to expect as a new author or a new writer. But yeah, otherwise there are links to my book and my first free chapter that I offer in the description or in my or on my profile, depending on what platform you're viewing this on. And also, please like or follow or comment. I love to see comments, people suggesting new things that they want to talk about. I think the next thing that I'm going to be talking about is magic systems for my next creative writing workshop. So yeah, if you have any particular thing that you want to learn about or you want to discover, please feel free to leave a comment below, or, you know, whatever. You get the gist. So I'm going to leave this video here. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate the support that everyone gives me. But until then, I will see you guys later. Bye, guys.